Frederick Weinberg was the last male survivor of his family, so at the age of 11, he became the man of the house. He shared his home with his sister of 9 years old, his mother, and his grandmother, whom he called Moma. His mother had borne 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Only 2 had survived. One was said to have been cursed by the witches, a thing that could not even be looked upon. Its arms and legs twisted, its spine bent. His face was covered in the hair of a wolfen animal, its eyes yellow as the flames of a fire could be. Frederick's father had said that when his mother was at market, a witch had followed her to the man who sold his bread, and that witch had placed her hand on his mother's stomach and pronounced the child to be hers, and mumbled some words that no one could understand before the shopkeepers pushed her away with their brooms. She then returned to her home in the dark woods. When the infant had been born, Frederick's father told him that the thing had died within minutes, that he had taken the abomination outside of the cabin, away from the sight of his mother, who was crying out in agony over the thing she had borne. Frederick's father told him that he had buried the thing in the forest, where he could never be seen again, where he could go back to the hell whence he had come. Frederick never asked questions about it. He knew that this was not a tale that his parents wanted to ever tell again, that they kept it closed up, locked inside their hearts, to never see daylight again. Frederick's father had passed away from consumption, and his dying words to Frederick were to take care of his ma and his moma. Frederick did the best that he could. He cut the firewood to keep the tiny cabin warm, with the stove always hot. He ran errands into the town. He shot the squirrels and the raccoons for eating, and dug the wild root vegetables for dinners. His mama would gather the eggs and take care of the goat and cow, and together they looked after his moma, who was getting older as the days went by, it seemed to Frederick. She seemed more pale and weak, and it was getting to be fall. So he made sure that they had extra wood ready, and his mother had canned the extra meats and vegetables. They'd most likely be snowed in for winter, so they had to prepare. There were apples that grew in the witch's forest, and even though it frightened him to go into the woods, he would take a potato sack and gather the apples for his mother to can for pies and applesauce. One day in October, the coldest day of the year so far, Moma became ill with a high fever. Frederick's mother's face bared the wrinkles of concern on her forehead. She sat by Mama with a cold cloth on her head as Mama tossed and turned and coughed the wet-sounding, mucus-filled cough. Finally, Ma came to Frederick and told him that he must run to town. He must go to the midwife and get the medicine for Mama's chest. He was told to tell her that she also had a fever. So when Frederick went out, he left with a knapsack to fill at the midwife's cabin, and 1 gold coin and a loaf of bread to pay her with. It was daylight out, but Frederick knew to go as quickly as possible so that he did not have to return after the sun had set in the witch's forest. Frederick ran the entire way there, but when he arrived, there were many people in line waiting to see the old woman, so Frederick waited and waited and waited. Finally, he walked into her cabin. It smelled of herbs and spices. Long stems of eucalyptus and lemongrass hung from the ceiling. As the midwife went around to her cabinets and drawers, she was whispering to herself. Frederick couldn't quite understand if she was praying or chanting, and as he strained to hear her better, she quickly turned around and handed him his knapsack. "Here, child. This is to brew into a tea for your grandmother. Get it to her as quickly as you can." And then she reached for a jar that had brown-colored substance inside of it. The midwife took off the lid, and suddenly an intense, musky, wretched smell came forth, and she shook her head. "Yes, this too, child. Rub this on the old woman's chest. It smells wicked, but it will be vital. to her recovery. "Do you understand, son?" she asked, and Frederick nodded his head. "Do not drop this, boy. Hold it close to your chest, and run along now. The sun is setting. The forest is no place for a child to be under the moonlight." Frederick paid the woman and began running down the dirt road, out of the town center, and onto the path of the forest. Soon, Frederick's legs began to become so tired, his every muscle burning, his arm cramping from holding the jar so tightly. The moon was full and bright, and he saw a fallen tree up ahead and decided to take a quick rest. Just for a bit, he thought. He came to the log, and he placed the jar and the knapsack gently on the ground. He had about half the way left, he figured. His breath was heavy, and when he exhaled, he could see the puffs of air come from his mouth and slowly disappear into the night. He looked around and suddenly felt the chill of the air. He hadn't felt it when he was running, but now it was settling into his bones. So cold, the wind blowing in his ears, and the bare trees casting their shadows. The shadows making the ground look like Frederick was surrounded by long, thin creatures with reaching fingers and sharp teeth. Frederick shook his head, knowing that he was letting the dark get to him. The tales of these woods being the home to the witches that would snatch a child if you dare take your eye off of him. The witches that would cast a spell on his own brother, turning him into half-infant, half-wolf being, abomination from hell. Suddenly Frederick found himself terrified to be there, the shadows of the trees stretching out as if to grab him with those hands. The witches' hands, long and bent, reaching out ever so slowly to snatch him up, to cook him over a fire, to cackle and dance in the full moon's light. Frederick was getting himself so worked up that when he heard the wolf howl, he jumped. He grabbed the knapsack and he began to run as fast as he could, hearing the broken branches snapping under his feet. And were those snapping noises coming from behind him as well? The wind worked itself up into a tizzy, and Frederick could have sworn that he heard a witch's cackle so close, so close. He could hear her. Was she calling his name? He turned right. Not far from now, he was thinking, his breath coming quickly. He was almost going to faint if he didn't stop himself from breathing so hard, he thought. And just then, he saw it. A wolf watching him, standing on his back legs, almost human-like. Shining yellow eyes peering at him, and beside the wolf creature, the abomination, stood an old witch, with one arm outstretched towards Frederick and the other around the creature, and it began to howl and scream. Was it screaming? The cackling was so loud in Frederick's ears now, as he ran faster than he'd ever run before, the howling and screaming just on his heels. As he came to the door of the cabin, and when his mother opened the door, she looked at him in shock. "Frederick, what was that noise?" she asked, pulling her shawl in close to look behind him in the woods. The woods were silent now, silent as the full moon shone down upon them. And as he handed his mother the knapsack, he realized just then that he'd left the jar with the vital medicine for his mama. Frederick was sick with shame as he answered that no, this was all he'd been given, his mother's face looking perplexed as she asked him again if he was sure that this was all he'd been given. He lowered his eyes as he stood in front of the fire, holding out his hands to warm them. "Yes, Mum, that is all." And his mother went to make the tea. Later that night, as Frederick took his turn sitting by his Moma while his mother slept, he could faintly hear a sound outside of the door. A scratching sound, he thought. Frederick froze in terror as he listened. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And he heard something on the top stair. It sounded as though someone had dropped a rock or something rather heavy. Frederick slowly backed into the corner of the cabin, his body shaking. And when the noise finally stopped, Frederick slowly and silently, as the cabin floor would let him, he walked to the door and opened it. Just a crack. To his surprise, there, at his feet, was the jar of the medicine he'd left at the tree. He quickly bent down to get it, wondering just how it had gotten there. Who? What? When out of the corner of his eye, he saw the shadowy figure of the wolf creature watching him silently from the woods. Frederick grabbed the jar and locked the door as quickly as he could, and then he could have sworn that he heard the wolf howl as though he were in pain. A sorrowful howl.